Here we go. All ones.
When the people of Earth took their first steps into the stars, they took them with the hope of a new age of peace and exploration. But these hopes were soon shattered as they found only a great enemy in the deep black of space. This enemy was a millennia-old imperium known as the Zero-Circa, a massive star-spanning empire with thousands of worlds under the harsh rule of the extraterrestrial human species known as Valani. What followed after first contact was an age of warfare lasting 250 years called the Interstellar Wars. These wars ushered in an era of untold death and destruction never before witnessed in the long, war-torn histories of Terra. When these conflicts ended, Terra found itself as a new interstellar superpower as the many oppressed peoples of the fallen Valani Imperium began to look to Terra, and not the imperial homeworld of land, for leadership after the once mighty Shadow Emperor of the Zero-Circa became an honored guest of the Terran Navy. Though the Terrans came out victorious from this age of strife, it left them asking, now what? As a new order had to be forged from the ashes of the old Valani regime, what came next promised to be an age of freedom and exploration that was once hoped for by the Terrans, but only if they could hold back the tides of chaos, as times of peace can often be more difficult than times of war. During the Interstellar Wars and their aftermath, the Terran Confederation faced many social issues. Even before the Interstellar Wars had ended, the Terrans found themselves greatly expanding through the stars. At first, the people of Earth colonized virgin worlds untouched by the hands of any star-faring race. But as the Interstellar Wars dragged on, many Terrans began to settle on newly conquered worlds once held by the Zero-Circa. Many Terrans found these already settled worlds with established infrastructures and friendly populations who saw the Terrans as liberators, as a more welcoming option than the harsh life on a rugged frontier world. With this new influx of Terran population, these former Valani worlds began to quickly adopt Terran culture, and as this Terran culture spread, more and more worlds began to join the Terran Confederation. Then at some unnoticed moment, the off-world administrations and military personnel of the Terran Confederation had slowly become made up of those off-world Terran colonials, many of whom had family ties with the Valani of the worlds they had settled and had never seen Earth herself. While Terra herself entered a new era of peace and prosperity, her colonies continued fighting the Great War against the Zero-Circa. Despite this, the Confederation's politics remained dominated by the interests of the Sol system, especially the old nation-states of Earth who still controlled the Secretariat 250 years after its founding. As the decades wore on, the colonial worlds became increasingly aware of their common identity and realized they were worlds who had their own interests different from that of Earth. This realization became known as the Great Schism, a vast social movement driven by demographic changes within the Confederation, a movement that had quickly gained traction due to the lack of representation of colonial Terrans within the Secretariat. These issues had long been ignored while the lingering Valani threat was of paramount importance, but as the Valani threat became less of an issue, these problems became the elephant in the room obvious to all. And when the book The Great Schism was written by Hans Adakati in -2280 became a bestseller, its sober analysis of the growing cultural divide between Earth and her colonies became the hot topic issue for all Terrans, both from Earth and her colonies. Though no political recommendation was made by Hans, a social analyst had awoken the political awareness of the colonial population, causing the colonies to become increasingly aware of their own common identity. Though these colonials remained loyal to the Confederation and dutifully continued the war against the Zero-Circa, there was a growing resentment that drove on the Great Schism, much to the annoyance of the Secretariat. After the surrender of the Zero-Circa, the Terran Confederation had found itself overstretched, as at the time of the Valani surrender, the Confederation directly controlled 1,300 worlds, and after the surrender of the Shadow Emperor to the Terran Navy, it then had 8 times as many worlds who are now looking to them for guidance. All while the communication lines from the military frontier took over a year to get back to Terra. The situation was left to Grand Admiral Kovacs, the overall commander of Confederation forces, to take swift action and prevent the total collapse of the military frontier, as many Valani worlds were still in open revolt, while others who had never even seen a Terran were requesting aid as Volani nobles turned warlord, and pirates flooded the much-needed trade lanes, causing economic hardships throughout the newly conquered Imperium. Admiral Kovacs' answer to the problem was a simple one. He would strip his fleet down to skeleton crews and send his officers out to give temporary guidance and leadership to the still intact Volani bureaucracy. Though the Volani nobility had been removed, the Imperial bureaucracy remained dutifully at their posts. So Kovacs, acting without orders from the Secretariat, sent the Confederation military personnel to administrate the worlds of the former Imperium in the name of Terra. Often newly commissioned ensigns found themselves acting as the political head of entire worlds, while captains of light cruisers now found themselves directing the Imperial bureaucracy of entire subsectors. This change of management left the basic Imperial system intact as Terran military personnel took over the old positions once held by the Volani nobility. Admiral Kovacs had intended this to be merely a stopgap measure until civilian leadership could be sent from Terra to relieve them. However, this relief was a long time in coming, as there was not enough civilian personnel to go around, so most of these military leaders had to wait in their positions indefinitely for relief that would never arrive. On many Imperial worlds, these military leaders found that they were not only expected to provide political leadership, but quickly discovered the populations of these worlds they administered expected them to perform the ceremonial duties the Volani nobility before them had done. When it became less likely that the civilian leadership would ever arrive to relieve them, they found that a new unofficial ruling class was forming around these Terran officers and their Volani bureaucrats, as they were now seen as the only ones who could keep everything together after the fall of the Zerasirka. This change of leadership was only able to succeed at all was due to the devotion of the billions of Volani bureaucrats who continued to execute their duties despite the fall of Zerasirka. Though the Terran officers once looked upon these Volani bureaucrats as their enemy, they were now seen as a much respected ally in a new battle against the socio-economic collapse of interstellar society. A collapse that would have cost untold lives, as infrastructure and supply lines that supported entire worlds would have failed if these bureaucrats had not stayed at their posts. As Admiral Kovacs was stabilizing the worlds of the Imperium, the Secretariat had plans of their own for the new Volani conquests. While the Terran Confederation Navy was working hard to stabilize the former Imperium and stood ready to expand Terran influence beyond the sphere of Earth and her colonies, the Secretariat still thought of themselves in terms of a single world and were ill-prepared to govern a territory the size of the growing Confederation, as it absorbed the multicultural peoples of the Zerasirka while dealing with their own, increasingly independent-minded colonies. Thus they found themselves woefully ill-prepared to take over the rulership of the Volani's grand empire of stars. The first step of the Secretariat's plan was to get rid of the colonial-born Admiral Kovacs, who was now seen as politically unreliable as he began to more and more rely on the Volani bureaucracy. To replace him, the Secretariat went with Admiral Hiroshi Estagaribia, an Earth-born officer who was seen as someone much more politically in line with the Secretariat's agenda. Hiroshi Estagaribia was born in Lima, Peru, to a family with no military tradition. His father was a robotics specialist, while his mother was an expert in ancient Terran history. At the age of 3, Hiroshi's father began to work at the Confederation Naval Research Facility in Quito as a civilian, where Hiroshi grew up hearing soldiers tell stories of battles fought against the Volani and of adventures the military personnel had on distant worlds. So at a time when native Terrans were no longer joining the military en masse, and the colonial populations who were closer to the military frontier took up arms against the Zerasirka, Hiroshi had become determined to one day see these far-off worlds for himself and joined the Terran Navy, where he proved to be a well-respected leader who led from the front during the late Interstellar Wars. By -2224, Hiroshi was in command of the battleship Temujin during the Battle of Three Suns, where the Volani Navy was at last crushed. During the battle, Hiroshi was serving as flag captain to Admiral Leon Gerasimov, and when Gerasimov was killed by a lucky hit to the Temujin's bridge, Hiroshi rallied the flagship and took command of the fleet, turning the tide of the Battle of Three Suns in a stunning reversal, earning him the nickname the Terran Alexander. When the Zerasirka made its final surrender, Hiroshi found himself in a unique position, as he was a proven and famous wartime leader that had the trust and admiration of the Terran colonies who made up most of the Confederation naval personnel, and as a native-born Terran, he was regarded as trustworthy by the Secretariat. So in -2209, he was appointed as Grand Admiral of the Confederation Navy, replacing the Lagash-born Admiral Kovacs, who was politely but firmly encouraged to retire. With Admiral Kovacs out of the picture and believing the crisis of the Volani threat over, the Secretariat early in -2204 narrowly voted in to transfer control of all Terran colonies and conquer territories of the former Zerasirka directly to the Secretariat and ordered the Volani bureaucracy to be dissolved. In this order, all former Volani worlds would be incorporated into the Terran Confederation as as subject territories under the direct control of the Secretariat itself, and were to be administrated as spoils of war, where these colonies would be stripped of what little representation they had, as their resources would be diverted to benefit the people of Terra, a world many colonials, due to the Great Schism, no longer saw as their home. Most importantly, this order threatened to undo all the hard work the Terran Navy had done to stave off total socio-economic collapse of the old Volani Imperium, causing many in the Terran Navy to take action. The commander of the Confederation Navy, Grand Admiral Hiroshi, though far from Terra, was not blind as to what was happening in the Secretariat and how it would affect things to come. Seeing that the Secretariat was unable to fathom the sheer size of the fallen Imperium, while also understanding how short-sighted the Secretariat's plan was, Hiroshi began quietly reshuffling the Confederation Navy's leadership in the name of finding more politically reliable personnel in line with the Secretariat's plans, as who would be more trustworthy to do this than the Terran-born hero of the Battle of Three Suns. But in reality, Hiroshi found people who were loyal to him or were alienated colonials disillusioned by the Secretariat's ever-increasing Terran-centric policies. More importantly, he gained the political support of the military governors installed by Admiral Kovacs before him, who wished to remain in their positions the Secretariat soon planned to do away with. This was easily done as the Secretariat saw Hiroshi as their man on the inside and had full faith that he could keep the colonial personnel of the Navy in line. But despite their trust in Hiroshi, he had slowly but surely brought the majority of naval personnel throughout the Confederation in line with his plans, and not those of the Secretariat. As most military units of the Confederation were composed largely of disinfected colonials or naval officers who wanted to retain their military governorships in Volani space, so the Navy readied themselves for Hiroshi's plan to stop the Secretariat's disastrous directive before it ended poorly for them all. In late -2204, the coup was launched against the civilian government of the Terran Confederation, and due to the careful planning of Hiroshi, this coup went off with little bloodshed, as the remaining forces still loyal to the Secretariat were too few to stop the massive Terran war machine built up during the Interstellar Wars. After the coup, Hiroshi stripped the Secretariat of its political power, reverting their authority back to the representative nation-states. This prevented Terra from being able to build up any united front against the Navy, as the nation-states turned on each other, which caused Terra to retreat from interstellar politics as a whole. With the Secretariat taken care of, Grand Admiral Hiroshi gave a speech from the Confederation Naval Fleet Headquarters on Dengir. In the speech, he announced to all the people of the Terran Confederation and the Imperium alike that the best way forward for all would be to continue to use the still intact imperial political structures while upholding the ideals of Terran freedom. To do this, the military governors would remain in their newly installed offices, and through the authority of the Shadow Emperor, who still remained an honored guest of the Terran Navy, would be given Volani titles, which according to Volani custom would make them the new government officials of their imperial worlds. This meant that the naval personnel were officially installed under imperial law and could now legally govern through the old channels of the Volani bureaucracy with little to no resistance. Hiroshi then declared this new era not to be a confederation or a grand empire of the stars, but this new era would be known as the rule of man, wherein the ideals of Terran freedom, all humans of the Imperium, be they Terran-born, colonial, or Volani, would be equal and free. At the end of this speech, Hiroshi announced that he, with the approval of the Shadow Emperor and the authority of the Terran Navy, would be the new regent of the Volani Imperium and protector of Terra. Make no mistake, despite the boastful declarations of freedom and how the Secretariat has been painted by history as foolish, greedy, and inward-looking politicians who were only looking after their own interests, this was a military coup that brought down the duly elected civilian governor of the Confederation by riding the waves of unrest caused by the Great Schism to seize power, as they knew the mostly Volani populace of the old Imperium wanted a new emperor, and the mostly colonial navy wanted that new emperor to be one of their own. Early in his regency, Hiroshi moved quickly to dissolve many of the social shackles placed upon the people of the old Imperium during the rule of the Zarasurka. These reforms worked, or at least worked on paper, as many of the Volani still clung to their old imperial traditions. Despite their new freedom, the rigid caste system of Zarasurka could not completely be dismantled overnight, as the old economic system established by the Volani was still needed to support the newly born rule of man. Though new freedoms were had by many, these were not the all-encompassing freedoms Hiroshi had envisioned, as a solid economic base was needed to be maintained for the good of all within the rule of man. Hiroshi Hiroshi also instituted autonomous rule for large portions of the rule of man, and by -2196, Hiroshi had codified the succession procedures, establishing the Council of Officers. This council was made up of Terran officers who held the Lani title and would be responsible for electing the future regents of the rule of man, while acting as an advisory body for those regents. Hiroshi, throughout his regency, presented himself as a champion for all the peoples of humanity, be they Terran, colonial, or Lani. Though his regency was plagued with economic troubles due to the rebuilding process after the war, it was a stable regency. In his later years as regent, Hiroshi came down with an incurable degenerative neural disorder, causing Hiroshi to become increasingly dependent upon his adopted son and chief of staff, Admiral Yez Genev, and in -2184, Regent Hiroshi named Genez as his successor, which was quickly ratified by the Council of Officers. Hiroshi died in -2182, where he was mourned throughout the rule of man, though strangely enough, he was mourned more so in the old Lani Imperium than on Terra and her older colonies. The successor of Hiroshi was Yev Genez Estagaribia. Yev was born in the Terran city of Tel Aviv in -2234 and lost both his parents at an early age. His mother had died in childbirth, while his father was killed fighting the Lani in the Interstellar Wars when Yev was just 3 years old. After his father's death, Yev was adopted by then Captain Hiroshi Estagaribia, who raised him as his own. Yev followed in both his father and adopted father's footsteps when he entered the Terran Confederation Combined Naval Academy in -2216 and graduated first in his class. Though Yev proved to be a solid commander of combat troops, his true skill laid in administration, and spent much of his career attached to the Navy Political Directorate. Due to these skills in administration, he was chosen early on as one of the military governors to administrate a large area of the conquered Zerosirka. By the time of the coup in -2204, Admiral Yev Estagaribia was serving as adjutant to his adopted father and remained near to him throughout his regency as chief of staff, which effectively made Yev the second most powerful figure in the rule of man. As Regent Hiroshi began to succumb to his infirmity, Yev as chief of staff began to slowly take on the responsibilities of his adopted father as he became more and more incapable of performing the duties of regent. So by the time of Hiroshi's death in -2182, it was no surprise the Council of Officers unanimously voted in Admiral Yev as the next regent of the Imperium and protector of Terra. The first task at hand for the newly appointed regent was to mop up the final pockets of Lani resistance to the rule of man. So Yev ordered a campaign to defeat the last of these holdout Lani nobles turned warlord in -2180. After this campaign concluded, Regent Yev Estagaribia made a speech to all the people of the rule of man in the Lani language, announcing at long last that the threat of the Zerosirka had ended and that humanity, both Lani and Solomani, could live together in peace, side by side now that the Zerosirka was no more. The usage of the word Solomani was an interesting choice by Yev, as it was a Lani word that meant people of soul, referring to the home star and not the home world of the Terrans, and was used for the first time during this speech, where soon after it became synonymous with the descendants of the Sol system and her colonies, so much so that the old Imperial Rim, where the Terrans first sprang from, soon after became known as the Solomani Rim. The use of Sol over Terra was a deliberate choice by Yev, as the term of Terran had fallen out of favor with the many colonials who now outnumbered the Earthborn Solomani many times over. During the speech, Yev Estagaribia also declared that he would no longer be regent, but a new emperor, and took the name Emperor Hiroshi II, taking on the name of his adopted father, Hiroshi I. It should be noted I could find no information as to the fate of the last Shadow Emperor of the Zerosirka. Likely this honored guest of the rule of man's navy had long overstayed their welcome, and had left like so many other inconvenient threats to political power before them. This newly crowned emperor realized a central capital was needed for the rule of man, and transferred all governmental and military functions from Dingir, the military headquarters, and Bland, the bureaucratic capital, to a more centrally located world in the Marcellus sector, renaming this world bilingually in English and Lani to Hub Ishur. Though this move angered many Solomani from the worlds colonized directly by the Terran Confederation, as they saw this move as a way of decreasing their influence within the new Imperium. But despite this anger, Hub Ishur would remain the capital of the rule of man for the next 400 years. With this new imperial capital in place, Emperor Hiroshi II renamed many of the political organizations in the old Terran Confederation in line with his new imperial authority, such as the Council of Officers now becoming the Council of Noble Officers, with many of the military governors adopting noble titles from old Earth, a tradition which has continued to this day even by non-Solomani. Though the rule of man under Emperor Hiroshi II continued to be plagued by economic troubles, it remained stable throughout most of his reign, reign despite facing a large-scale rebellion by the Durmai, a minor human race who had once supported the Soleimani in their war against the Zoroastrica. This uprising was put down largely by Vellani forces, though led by a popular Soleimani admiral named Teresa who was held in high regard by the Vellani under her command, who in -2164, after defeating the Durmai revolt, was promoted to chief of staff. Though defeated, the Durmai continued to be a troublesome element within the rule of man. Hiroshi II's rule was known for ending the plague of Duskyr. During the days of the Interstellar War, many diseases were spread from Earth by Soleimani troops and merchants. These were found to be devastating to the Vellani and other minor human races of humanity. Though the Soleimani tried to use their better medical technology to contain and control these outbreaks, the death toll from these diseases across Vellani space was in the billions, as the immune systems of non-Soleimani were not accustomed to such virulent disease. The plague of Duskyr was not a single disease, but rather many infections normally harmless to Soleimani, but incredibly deadly to Vellani. The most common of these infections were two varieties of yeast, staph infection, and a variety of different venereal diseases. Plague of Duskyr was named for the Vellani doctor who first recognized the cause and developed a proper treatment for these diseases, which Dr. Duskyr was able to do with the help of more advanced Soleimani medical technology, which were now made available to him under the rule of man. With access to this new medical knowledge and the use of the facilities at Dishadshai University, Dr. Duskyr was able to first bring the diseases under control on his home planet, and then throughout the rule of man. The lessons learned from the plague of Duskyr and the techniques developed by the doctor himself have taught humanity how to contact minor human races without wiping them out unintentionally with disease. This was only able to be achieved by using the broad-spectrum antiviral drugs developed by Dr. Duskyr. The end of Hiroshi II's reign left the rule of man in stable condition and in good hands, as in -2163, Chief of Staff Teresa was announced as the ailing emperor's successor by the Council of Noble Officers, taking over as emperor in her own right when Hiroshi II died of congestive heart failure in -2162. Teresa was born on the colonial world of Prometheus, one of the first to be colonized by the old Terran Confederation. The first contact with the Vellani had sparked a colonization boom. Teresa was raised by working-class parents who supported her in her schooling and was elated to find out that Teresa had won a scholarship to the prestigious Geelong Grammar School on Terra. After her studies there, Teresa entered the newly formed Rule of Man Naval Academy on Hub of Shur in -2202. After her graduation, she saw service in Hiroshi II's wars against the small pockets of Vellani resistance that still remained, where Teresa proved to be a naval officer of considerable ability and personal charisma. During these conflicts, Teresa worked closely with Vellani forces who once saw service with the Zoroastrica, but now fought alongside the Rule of Man Navy, fighting forces that were now vital in subduing the last pockets of Zoroastrica resistance. During these battles, Teresa quickly earned the respect and admiration of the Vellani under her command, despite her dislike of the restrictive nature of the Vellani social structure. Though she held a dislike for the Vellani social order, she held the Vellani themselves in high regard. While acting as military governor of the Expanse sector, she earned the respect of the Vellani under her rule by enacting many reforms to the old imperial system in the Expanse sector, aimed at loosening the caste structure imposed by the former Zoroastrica. After the Durmai Rebellion was put down by Admiral Teresa, she was appointed Chief of Staff by Hiroshi II and named the successor to the imperial throne soon after. During her time as Chief of Staff, Teresa pledged to make the reforms she instituted in the Expanse sector empire-wide, so it was no surprise when she did ascend to the throne in -2162, becoming the third emperor of the rule of man. With the backing of many powerful elements within the Council of Noble Officers, mainly those from the native Terran factions who wished to see an end to all elements of the former Zoroastrica, the newly crowned Emperor Teresa set out to enact her reforms, giving many Vellani their first real taste of freedom after suffering under the harsh rule of the Shadow Emperors. But these reforms were tempered by calls of caution amongst the more conservative elements of the rule of man, calls that came from both the Soleimani and Vellani alike. The lasting change that the Emperor wanted to make, while significant, proved to be less than she had initially hoped, especially in the forward provinces of the rule of man, where more conservative Vellani customs were more deeply rooted as a cultural norm. Emperor Teresa made many enemies among the military governors who did not want to lose their power and merely played lip service or outright ignored the reforms. Nonetheless, the reform process of the Vellani caste system had started and would continue in one form or another throughout the history of the rule of man, laying the groundwork to build new ideals of freedom for countless Vellani who had once only known the oppression of the Zoroastrica. Though a great victory for freedom, the dismantling of the old Vellani caste system had terrible effects on the economy of the rule of man, as they had inherited the economic system of the Zoroastrica, which had depended upon the Villani caste system to survive. This caste system was one of the most obvious examples of cultural rigidity within the First Imperium, as each person was in effect required to perform the same job their parents had done before them, while each world had their production isolated and limited as a means of preventing any one world from becoming too self-sufficient, making them dependent on the monopolized trade conducted by their Villani overlords to maintain their world's economic and industrial basis. So the unseen effect of Teresa's reforms was that the delicate balance of the Villani economic system began to come apart, as people were now able to move freely or change their position in life, creating a gap in the labor force of many worlds, causing an avalanche of disruption starting from the lowest labor at the beginning, then ending at the highest levels of the rule of man's economy. The reign of Emperor Teresa ended unexpectedly when she died in negative 2151, as her flagship suffered catastrophic jump failure as it jumped out of the Dengar system en route for the capital of Hub-Ashur. No trace of the Roms particles were ever found. This event left many wondering if there was a conspiracy to end Teresa's life and stop the reforms, as many people of influence who were profiting from the old Villani caste system were not happy with the reforms. Having died unexpectedly, Emperor Teresa had left no named successor but was succeeded by her chief of staff, Yakov Petrovic, who was rapidly voted in by the Council of Noble Officers as regent in the aftermath of her unexpected death. Most likely Yakov was chosen to prevent any sign of instability within the rule of man that was still finding its feet as a new empire while trying to tackle the socio-economic issues left to them by the Zirasirka. Yakov held the office of regent for 7 years before Teresa was officially declared dead and was crowned emperor in negative 2150. Yakov Petrovic was born on the world of Dengir, the then headquarters of the rule of man's navy, so it was no surprise that he found himself enrolling in the Naval Academy there. Though he had a rather unremarkable career as a naval officer, he was able to rapidly rise up the ranks due to the patronage of Teresa Duyantoghestu, who was then chief of staff. Emperor Yakov acted mostly as a figurehead for the Council of Noble Officers throughout his reign, though he did have a few moments where he shined, such as continuing with the reforms of Emperor Teresa to dissolve the Villani caste system and dealing with the pack species known as Vargar, who had been raiding the cored regions of the Imperium since the later days of the Interstellar Wars. But up until Yakov's rule, the Vargar were content with raiding the cored worlds of the former Zirasirka that were outside the control of the rule of man. These raids sparked growing concern as a series of conflicts broke out along the border where the Navy held the Vargar in check, mainly due to the quick action taken by Emperor Yakov. Though contained, these Vargar raids would continue to be a thorn in the side of the rule of man. Emperor Yakov's reign was most noteworthy for the Articles of Assumption, a rewriting of Emperor Hiroshi I's speech declaring the rule of man. By creating the Articles of Assumption, they became a constitution of sorts for the rule of man. This document laid down the rights and powers of the state and nobility while affirming the succession process into law. This was a very important document as it codified the leading role of the Navy in political affairs into the political head of the rule of man. No longer would naval personnel be ruling in the name of the Shadow Emperor who had long vanished from the pages of history. The Navy would now rule both the Terran Confederation and the Zirasirka under their own imperial authority. Likely these articles made the more conservative pro-Terran factions in the Council of Noble Officers who were opposed to the reforms a bit more happy while Emperor Yakov pushed through his reforms, enabling him to sleep a bit better while making long jump trips on his flagship. But in the end, these were to no avail as the conservative factions and the Council of Noble Officers eventually forced Emperor Yakov to advocate in negative 2145, where then Yakov retired to his private estates on his homeworld of Dengir to live out a quiet life well away from the spotlight of politics. Yakov was soon replaced by the popular figure in the Council of Noble Officers named Zhou Ye-Zhang, who was born on the world of Agita and rose to the rank of admiral under the rulership of Emperor Teresa, a post he continued to hold under the Emperor Yakov. Admiral Zhou was a very popular member of the imperial court and was a very much loved elderly statesman in the Council of Noble Officers. Admiral Zhou was also a particularly popular figure among the Villani sections of the Navy who made up the majority of lower and middle ranks at this time, giving him major influence within the Council of Noble Officers, so it was no surprise he was proclaimed emperor in negative 2139. Though well liked by all, Emperor Zhou only ruled for 2 years before his death, causing him to really be only a footnote in the histories of the rule of man, as he was really only noteworthy as being the last of the old guard emperors born in the old Terran Confederation before the rise of the rule of man. As stated before, Emperor Joe's reign only lasted 2 years due to his age, causing his reign to be marred by his declining health. His condition rapidly deteriorated in the second year of his reign, leading to his voluntary euthanasia in negative 2137. During the reign of Emperor Joe, the disgruntled Soleimani from the worlds of the old Terran Confederation, who had difficulty in adapting to their vastly reduced influence in the new Imperium, had began to set out into the deep vastness of space to colonize distant stars far from the military dictatorship of the rule of man. These Soleimani were seeking out a new way of life on new worlds, far beyond the rule of man in the spinward sectors of Magyar, Dark Nebula, and Reaver's Deep. This exodus was a sign of things to come as the old worlds directly colonized by Terra began to become disenfranchised of their decreasing influence they now held in the new Imperium. After the death of Emperor Joe, Michael Kieran O'Connor was a controversial choice to replace the ailing emperor. Michael was a son of the Governor-General of the Expanse Sector, Admiral Kieran O'Connor, who later became Chancellor to Emperor Teresa, a position that was created in Teresa's reign to head the imperial bureaucracy, an office that Admiral Kieran held well into the reign of Emperor Yakov before retiring in negative 2145. The O'Connor family was an old Navy family who could claim direct descent from both the captain of the Starleaper II that made first contact with the Volani and the famous war hero of the 8th Interstellar War, Admiral Manuel Abawadi. So it's no wonder that Michael joined the Navy and fought in the growing conflicts of the non-human pack species called Vargar. During these punitive expeditions into the covert frontier, Michael made a reputation as a reliable and capable commander, quickly rising in the ranks, and in negative 2140, Emperor Yakov, in a surprise move, named Michael Vice-Chancellor at the extremely young age of 30. No doubt this choice was due to his mother's influence as Chancellor, but despite this, he proved to be excellent in the position of Vice-Chancellor, a position he held well into the reign of Emperor Joe, where due to the failing health of the Emperor, often ran the day-to-day affairs of the Imperial Court as well as acting as the Chancellor in the running of the Imperial bureaucracy in his absence. Michael's talents as Vice-Chancellor attracted many powerful patrons, notably Admiral Helena Chugulescu, a powerful faction leader within the Council of Noble Officers and commander of the Hub Ashur Fleet. As Admiral of the Hub Ashur Fleet, Helena was able to successfully prevail upon the ailing Emperor Joe to name Michael as successor before he died, replacing the already named Admiral Tumate Nakome, who was the Governor-General of the Soleimani Rim province. This action proved to be a focal point for the already growing dissent in the Soleimani Rim, but nonetheless, Michael ascended the throne as the 6th Emperor of the Rule of Man in negative 2137, upon Emperor Joe's death by a narrow vote of the Council of Noble Officers, where his patron Admiral Chugulescu no doubt used her influence to sway votes in his favor. As Emperor, Michael continued the reforms of his predecessors, with a particular focus on enacting them within the core Volani regions of his realm who still resisted the reforms. The first major step of these reforms was to dilute the power of the 3 great Volani burexes, which still held major influence in the bureaucracy of the Rule of Man. Though these burex were instrumental in the early days of the Rule of Man, they were now an inconvenient tool that was no longer needed by the Governor-Generals of the new Imperium, and so in negative 2128 their administrative functions were transferred to the provincial governors, and the burex would now function strictly as a ceremonial entity within the imperial hierarchy. Also among the new reforms enacted by Emperor Michael was increased autonomy to the Lycaean and Dermai, the later of whom were proving to be a rather troublesome people. This autonomy was granted with an exchange for pledges of loyalty. With this new autonomy granted, several Lycaean officers were promoted to senior naval posts, and a native Dermai was even named the Governor-General of the Eilish subsector, giving them a seat on the Council of Noble Officers. Undoubtedly, these reforms made life better for many in the Rule of Man, but for those in the Soleimani Rim, these reforms were seen as ways of reducing their influence for colonial Volani interests, and became a rallying cry for calls for their own autonomy. So in negative 2125, a growing movement began to gain traction in the rimward regions of the Imperium that were dominated by worlds that had been directly colonized by Terra. This movement was led by the flamboyant Governor-General of the Soleimani Rim, Admiral Nakome, whom Michael had subverted as heir to the throne. Nakome demanded the people of the old Terran Confederation be granted the same autonomy the Lycaean and Dermai had. For 5 years, he had pushed hard in the Council of Noble Officers for a Soleimani Autonomous Zone to be created. But in negative 2120, instead of getting autonomy, Nakome was dismissed from his post as Governor-General of the Soleimani Rim in hopes of derailing this movement. But instead, this act only added more fuel to the already burning issue, turning a political hot topic into a personal feud between Emperor Michael and Nakome. After Nakomi was removed of his governorship, he publicly called out Emperor Michael's legitimacy to rule, claiming that the ailing Emperor Joe had been coerced into changing his successor while sick in his deathbed. Faced with allegations to his illegitimacy and the rising discontent of the Soleimani Rim, Emperor Michael ordered a crackdown in negative 2118, issuing warrants of arrest for Nakomi and his senior followers, as well as other known dissenters that were unconnected to the autonomy movement. This included the civil rights activist and academician Valentin Sarakov, who had little to do with Nakomi or his political activities. Nakomi, having the popular support of the Soleimani Rim, was able to avoid arrest and spent the next 4 years on the run from imperial authorities. The turning point of this dispute began on the world of Dengir, the capital of the Soleimani Rim, as a widespread riot broke out across the world during the negative 2117 Assumption Day celebration. This was a holiday commemorating Hiroshi I's coup and ascension to regent. These riots were only suppressed with considerable cost of life and property by imperial authorities, causing even more unrest in the Soleimani Rim, as many were now calling for independence. When Emperor Michael got the news of these riots, he prepared to declare martial law on the key worlds of the Soleimani Rim, including Dengar, Agita, and even Terra itself. But Nakomi was able to lay his plans well during his time on the run and was able to gain the support of many influential members of the Navy. So by the time Emperor Michael decided to deal with the unrest in the Soleimani Rim, he faced major opposition from large sections of the Council of Noble Officers, as many in this body still maintained political and familial ties to those worlds of the old Confederation. Ignoring the fact that his court held these sympathies for their forefathers, Emperor Michael, through his arrogance and stubbornness, had alienated much of the Council of Noble Officers, causing the crisis to escalate to a point where large portions of the fleet were now close to mutiny. Things were so bad by late negative 2117, Emperor Michael was facing a likely civil war, which forced him to embarrassingly back down from his position and compromise with Nakomi. The following negotiations took 4 years to complete, where Emperor Michael offered the worlds of the Soleimani Rim considerable autonomy, including the power to levy taxes and regulate interstellar trade within the Soleimani Rim. In return, Nakomi would abandon the more extreme demands of veto powers over imperial secession and the right to raise their own navy. Thus, the Rim Autonomy Decree was issued in negative 2113, after which the Governor-Generalship of the Soleimani Rim became little more than a commander of imperial naval forces in the province and led to the formation of the Terran Mercantile Community in the following year. The later years of Emperor Michael's reign was known for the wars against the ever-growing number of Varga raids as they built corsair bases in the core frontier of the rule of man. Its conflict lasted from negative 2113 to negative 2109, where the raids culminated in the Battle of Murin. In this battle, Admiral Severin Estagaribia, direct descendant of the regent Hiroshi I, destroyed several large Varga corsair fleets. Following Emperor Michael's death in 2108, the Council of Noble Officers was left deeply divided by the turbulent events of his rule. As a result, the council were ill-disposed to ratify Michael's named successor, his eldest son, Captain Andrew O'Connor. Although Andrew was a capable officer, his fitness as ruler was questionable at best. But fortunately for the stability of the rule of man, Andrew was not nearly as stubborn as his father had been, and in a short speech to the Council of Noble Officers, Andrew withdrew his claim to the throne. In this speech, Andrew humbly asked that his career not be prejudiced by the secession crisis, and left the Council of Noble Officers to consider the question of who would be emperor. To succeed Emperor Michael, the council chose Admiral Severin Estagaribia, a popular hero of the recent Battle of Murim that curtailed the Varga raids into the rule of man. Admiral Severin was a dashing figure and a direct descendant of Hiroshi I, making him a relatively easy choice by all factions in the council. Also in the admiral's favor was the fact that he was a field commander, which meant he was isolated from the politics of the imperial court, something the council hoped would make him somewhat more amenable than his inflexible predecessor. After being crowned Hiroshi III, he made sure his first act as emperor would be to deal with the Varga menace once and for all. Despite their defeat at the Battle of Murim, the Varga corsairs had continued to raid across the Imperium's forward borders. So in negative 2107, the Varga campaigns had begun with a series of lightning-fast assaults into the forward frontier, which saw the full military might of the rule of man directed at these alien pirates. After these campaigns, the Varga threat was muzzled, and Hiroshi II set about launching a series of internal reforms, the first of which was to decentralize the treasury system, which had the support of the upper echelons of the Navy, largely because few of them had more than a peripheral interest in economic matters. Hiroshi III hoped this reform would improve the economic economic situation that the rule of man had struggled with since its founding. The second reform was a much more delicate issue to handle, as up until this point in the history of the rule of man, most of the senior naval personnel, and therefore all of the members of the Council of Noble Officers, were pure Soleimani. In this reform, several non-Soleimani were promoted to key positions within the fleet, the most contentious of which was the appointment of Vellani Admiral Lagul Kakalami to the General Staff. This move alienated some of the more extreme Soleimani who still held old prejudice of the Vellani stemming from their ancestors' involvement in the Interstellar Wars, but despite the shake-up of the Council of Noble Officers, Hiroshi III was able to shore up support by courting Vellani naval personnel who were the majority of the middle and lower ranks of the Navy. Even though the reforms were feared and disliked by the more Soleimani upper leadership, they were endorsed by the core of the Navy personnel, so the Council had no choice but to go along with them. After the victories against the Vargar and the success of the reforms, Hiroshi III's popularity soared among the common people of the Imperium, enabling him to submit his authority as emperor. Hiroshi III's reign was marked as a high point for the rule of man, as external threats were dealt with and very little dissent was in the air. Most importantly, however, the socio-economic issues that had plagued the Imperium from its founding had seemingly died down, giving everyone a rising hope for the future of the rule of man. During this golden age, Hiroshi III used his popularity to quietly strengthen the powers of the emperor at the expense of the Council of Noble Officers, securing the idea that the emperor and not the council was the sole wielder of imperial power. At the end of Hiroshi III's reign in -2071, he became the only emperor of the rule of man to voluntarily give up the throne for his death, as he felt the Imperium was in a secure enough position to pass his throne down to his groomed successor, Chief of Staff Mordib, whereafter he retired to his private estates on the world of Varward in the Expanse sector, where he died 9 years later. Hiroshi III is widely remembered today as Hiroshi the Wise. It was Chief of Staff Mordib who followed Hiroshi III as the next emperor of the rule of man. Mordib al-Mansur al-Akbar Khalif was born on the capital world of Hubabshir to an old Navy family. Mordib ignored the wishes of his father, who wanted him to enter the Imperial Naval Academy, by entering the Rule of Man Marine Academy instead in -2103, where he pursued a successful career in the Marines and was promoted to Lieutenant General in -2076. Mordib would then go on to join Hiroshi III's staff later that year. Soon after, Mordib was the first non-Navy officer to hold the post of Chief of Staff, and was groomed to be the successor of Hiroshi III, becoming the 8th Emperor of the Rule of Man after Hiroshi's voluntary abdication in -2071. Though his predecessor left him a strong economy, Mordib was quickly faced with a renewed economic recession caused by the reforms of the past emperors to the socio-economic system of the Zoroastrica, which had began to resurface again despite the hard work to prevent such a thing happening during Hiroshi III's reign. To combat this economic downturn, Mordib granted generous incentives for major Vellani and Soleimani corporations alike, which included tax credits on interstellar trade, a major source of income for the rule of man. Despite these measures, the economic situation remained stagnant throughout large portions of the Imperium. This loss of revenue due to the corporate concessions caused the rule of man to no longer be able to fully fund its expenditures, and so began to increasingly borrow from moneylenders to make ends meet. But the necessity of these loans proved to be an unsound method of funding the Imperium, but was pursued by preceding emperors nonetheless. Later in his reign, Emperor Mordib promoted many civilians to a number of key posts within the Imperium, hoping that the greater expertise the civilians had in economic affairs over their naval counterparts would be of use in preventing further economic recession. This was something the Council of Noble Officers viewed with alarm, as they saw it as yet another attempt by another emperor to curb their own power, and feared that the emperor was planning to have the Imperium placed under civilian control. Due to these concerns, after the death of Emperor Mordib, the Council of Noble Officers promptly rejected the emperor's nominated successor, an event that had happened for the second time in 3 successions. This fact did little to install faith in the stability of the rule of man, even more so when the Council of Noble Officers decided to reject Emperor Mordib's chosen successor and elected Admiral Madeline Trent instead. Admiral Trent was a long outspoken opponent of Emperor Mordib, was leader of the hardline faction in the Council of Noble Officers, a faction who utterly rejected any form of civilian influence in the affairs of the Navy and by proxy the governance of the rule of man. The first act of Emperor Madeline was to dismiss all of Mordib's cabinet and replace them with her own supporters from within her hardline faction in the Council of Noble Officers. Emperor Madeline was a strong opponent of a fashionable theory among the upper circles of the Admiralty at the time, a theory that claimed the Imperium to be too large and too diverse to be effectively ruled by a single monarch, and so she gave the 17 most powerful governor-generals increased authority to rule over their own provinces directly as they saw fit. On the 150th anniversary of the fall of the Zura Circa, Emperor Madeline, mainly due to the pressures from her political faction, created the Pentarchy, a governing body made up of the four most powerful governor-generals from the sectors of Vlan, Transzura Shagard, Fornost, and the Expanse. These Pentarchs were given powers over their neighboring provinces and authority that nearly matched Madeline's own imperial authority. Madeline, as emperor, was the ruler of the Hub of Shur province and completed the Pentarchy's fifth member. While this was beneficial in the short term, Madeline's reforms set the stage for the disastrous disintegration of central authority and the powers of the emperors as a whole, something that would ultimately lead the rule of man down the long road of slow decline. After Emperor Madeline was pressured into relinquishing much of her imperial authority as emperor, she grew paranoid of the governor-generals, began to see them as a threat to her place in the imperium. In her paranoia, Emperor Madeline would ruthlessly deal with any dissent, especially among the civilian elements of the rule of man and the supporters of the former Emperor Mordib. To deal with these elements, Emperor Madeline greatly expanded the security apparatus of the rule of man, making the Directorate of State Security a feared and hated organization by all within the Imperium. Inevitably, these harsh measures resulted in unrest and open revolt in a number of provinces, the most serious of which occurred in the Marcellus sector in -2050, where the people rose up against the corrupt Pentarchy and its repressive governors. This revolt was suppressed using Genoese forces, a minor human race core of the Marcellus sector. Though these forces were Genoese, they were under imperial command. The unrest in the Marcellus sector and others were only put down through great amount of bloodshed and brutality. It was 4 years after this show of brutal force that the Emperor Madeline suffered a massive stroke and died soon after in -2046. Emperor Madeline left the rule of man with a bloody legacy of corruption that proved to linger in the ranks of the Navy long after her death. At the time of Emperor Madeline's stroke, the Viceroy of the Dermite Totality, Admiral Chandar Shepar Azarid, or more commonly known to those around him simply as Chandar, was one of the most powerful governor-generals of the rule of man. So it was no surprise that after Chandar got news of the Emperor's failing health, he traveled to Hub of Shur, and even though Madeline had a named successor in Admiral Costas Angelic, the head of the dreaded Directorate of State Security, Chandar immediately began to covertly gather support within the Council of Noble Officers. After Emperor Madeline died of her stroke in -2046, Chandar was fast to move, rallying his supporters as he led a palace coup that resulted in the summary execution of Admiral Costas Angelic. After the death of Angelic, Chandar's supporters then found the supporters of the dead emperor on the Council of Noble Officers and had them placed on house arrest as Chandar called the council into session. Chandar's plan was a simple one. By the exclusion of the council members who supported Madeline's successor from the council chambers during the vote of succession, Chandar was able to gain the 2/3 vote majority of sitting council members that was necessary to be named emperor. The means of Chandar's ascension caused a large number of senior naval officers to oppose his ascension, forcing Chandar to act quickly to cement his power by enacting a series of purges that removed Angelic's supporters from positions of authority. Although there are many holdouts that remained in the Transzura Shagard province where they were able to put together a small rebellion for a time, this holdout faction soon collapsed when most of their troops and lower-level commanders mutinied. These mutineers, in a grisly act of loyalty, took the head of the revolt's leader, Admiral Vance Roman, and delivered it to Chandar as a sign of the mutineers' loyalty to the new emperor. The remaining leaders of the revolt were soon rounded up and quickly sent into exile. The political instability surrounding the secession of Chandar had a predictable effect on the imperial economy, further damaging an already shaky economic foundation. Even more so after the initiatives enacted by Chandar to consolidate power, such as the dissolution of the Council of Noble Officers, and granting regional governors loyal to Chandar even more direct control of their regions, caused the rule of man to fall further into recession. These economic woes bred a new wave of unrest in many areas of the Imperium. Despite the regional governors now being empowered to use their own forces to suppress open revolt without having to appeal to the Imperial Court for support, the unrest continued to spread, causing further loss of confidence in the rule of man. Through his iron grip on power, Chandar was able to maintain control of the rule of man for the next 15 years. The divisions created by Chandar's coup would remain in the upper echelons of the military, albeit hidden under the surface. These tensions would resurface again as a cabal of former members of the Council of Noble Officers led by Admiral Hiiki Muramoto plotted Chandar's overthrow, using the justification that Chandar was an illegitimate ruler as he was not properly elected by the full Council of Noble Officers. Admiral Hiiki and his supporters, during an open session of the Imperial Court in -2029, blew the Emperor Chandar in a hail of laser fire. While Chandar lay dying in a pool of his own blood on the throne, he could only watch as Hiiki's followers seized the palace. Admiral Hiiki, having seized power in negative 2029 using much of the same methods as his predecessor, was in desperate need of political support. So Admiral Hiiki turned to the provincial naval commanders, who in turn for reconstituting the Council of Noble Officers as a body of somewhat more political powers than Hiiki envisioned. With the steel struck, the newly reinstalled Council of Noble Officers crowned Hiiki the new Emperor of the Rule of Man, an act which solidified Hiiki's power. This time around, the Council of Noble Officers would be composed almost exclusively of provincial commanders from the highest echelons of imperial politics. This act took away much of the political authority the Navy had and put it in the hands of the nobility. Emperor Hiiki marked the beginning of his reign as negative 2046 and not negative 2029. He actually ascended the throne, as he had the reign of Chandar mostly expunged from imperial history, claiming it to be illegitimate as Chandar assumed power through a violent coup and the assassination of the Emperor Madeline's designated heir. This was a bold claim by Emperor Hiiki, as he used much of the same methods as Chandar to become emperor himself. During Emperor Hiiki's reign, he survived no less than 9 assassination attempts before dying of heart failure in negative 2018. After his death, many rumors abound that his demise was the result of a 10th successful attempt on his life. The reign of both emperors, Hiiki and Chandar, left the rule of man in a disastrous state as political factions were now vying for power within the restored Council of Noble Officers, leaving the economic situation of the rule of man in the worst state it had been since its founding. Admiral Elise Papet would follow Emperor Hiiki to the throne in negative 2018 as the governor of the Trans-Era Shagar province and viceroy of the Vague Worlds. Admiral Papet was one of the more powerful leaders of the slowly splintering rule of man. During Emperor Hiiki's rule, Admiral Elise largely governed Trans-Era Shagar as an independent state, paying little attention to the imperial government of Hub Ashur, and cared little for the troubles caused by Chandar and Hiiki before her reign. Following Emperor Hiiki's death, the Council of Noble Officers chose Admiral Elise to succeed him, knowing all too well that her rule would continue to encourage the growing fractious tendencies that had characterized the last half-century of the rule of man. Emperor Elise herself looked upon the imperial throne more as a ceremonial title and retained her governorship of Trans-Era Shagar after her ascension to the throne, and spent much of her time in her provincial capital rather than the imperial capital of Hub Ashur, and left her vice-governor to rule Hub Ashur in her name. Emperor Elise's rule was rather uneventful, especially when compared to her two predecessors, as by the time of her reign, political power was held mostly by the governor-generals and not the emperor, making the rule of man little more than imperium in name only. Due to the fractious nature of the Council of Noble Officers after the death of Emperor Elise in negative 1997, two rival factions of the council elected their own emperors, effectively creating two imperiums, with one emperor ruling from the traditional capital of Hub Ashur, while the other ruled from the coalward region of Antares. These two imperiums were known as the Hub Ashur Imperium and the Antares Imperium, respectively. Both of these de facto governments agreed to maintain the fiction that they were merely different factions of the same imperial government and retained a common banking system and currency, but they were in fact two separate governments. These two imperiums continued on in slow decline until the year of negative 1776, which is an arbitrary date considered by many to mark the end of the rule of man. It was in this year the slow coming of financial collapse had at last arrived when the treasury of the Hub Ashur Imperium refused to honor a monetary issue from the treasury of the Antares Imperium. This resulted in a lack of confidence within monetary circles, causing the end of large-scale interstellar trade that was needed to sustain themselves from total financial collapse that had always haunted the rule of man from its founding. Although these imperiums did not completely fall apart for many years to come, the rule of man had effectively ceased to exist as a viable interstellar community, and the period known as Twilight had begun. This Twilight was a period of collapse that lasted for the next 2.5 centuries as interstellar travel and commerce was greatly reduced or outright disappeared, as the many former imperial worlds slowly turned inwards on themselves. The end of this Twilight period is commonly considered to be negative 1526, when the last governmental body claiming to be the rule of man ceased to exist. The problems that led to the collapse of the rule of man were the sheer size and social stagnation of the Zereth Circuit, which had inevitably led to their own downfall, problems that were then inherited by the Terrans as they founded the rule of man. The Vellani had coped with these problems by establishing a rigid caste system which rooted all citizens in their place in society. society, but it was a system that could not last for long when faced with external threats such as the Terran Confederation. And when the emperors of the rule of man abolished the Bellani caste system, they failed to establish a new social order to replace it, causing many industries to die off as their workers were now free to move elsewhere. As the Bellani found their jobs are no longer mandatory under Terran rule, it started a slow economic death as soon as the rule of man was founded. Though the Second Imperium was able to stave off total collapse for nearly 400 years, they were unable to stop the slow death of the old Bellani Imperium in the end. The last emperor of the rule of man to leave their name to history was arguably Emperor Eduardo of the Hub of Shur Imperium, who claimed to be descended from a original line of Second Imperium rulers. By the time Emperor Eduardo ruled, the last remnant of Terran or even Bellani interstellar community had already long been in the twilight phase of decline, and the long era of darkness known as Long Night was poised to plunge all into a new dark age. But that, travelers, is a tale for another time.
This is the rule of man's world. This is the rule of man's world. But it wouldn't be nothing, nothing without tradition or bureau. You see, the rule of man sees the stars and took us into space. The rule of man made the starships to spread the human race. The rule of man brought the Gauss rifle to beat the Sirosurka onslaught. The rule of man made the Mason guns like God made pillars of salt. This is the rule of man, man's world. But it would be nothing, nothing without tradition or a bureau. Rule of man thinks about our freedoms and our human rights. Rule of man makes it happen, 'cause rule of man's willing to go out and fight. But the rule of man can make anything, anything he can. So man don't have to make money and trade it from another man. This is the rule of man, man's world. But it would be nothing, nothing without tradition or bureau. He's lost in the chaos. He's lost in financial ruin. He's lost, Lord have mercy now, in the long night.
Hey kids, they're the newest rage in the consulate.
They're coins!
That's right. Now you too can command the secrets of the Droin Oracle.
They're coins!
Collect them, chase them, trade them with your friends.
They're coins!
Fun for all ages. Roll them, stack them, flip them, cast them.
They're coins!
Want to know if you'll do well on tomorrow's test? Dying to find out if your crush is crushing on you too? Just consult the coins.
They're coins!
Buy the 36-piece deluxe set. Get a blank 37th coin free. Put a picture on it. Your pet, your best friend, even yourself.
They're coins!
Available in 6 hot colors, including pink sparkle.
They're coins!
Expansions coming soon.
Coins have no psionic properties. Any instance of premonitions made utilizing them will be subject to mind scanning by thought police, followed by re-education or elevation to intended class as appropriate.
Fuck you, Drelisar! If you're dumb enough to buy contraband in this port, you're a big enough schmuck to come to Big Bill Hell's Dock. bad deals, ships at breakdown, reavers. Do you think you're gonna find a bargain at Big Bill's? You can kiss my ass. It's our belief that you're such a stupid motherfucker, you'll fall for this bullshit. Guaranteed. You find a better deal, shove it up your ugly ass. You heard us right. Shove it up your ugly ass. Bring your freight. Bring your spec goods. Bring your block. We'll fuck her. That's right. We'll fuck your block. Because at Big Bill Hells, you're fucked 6 ways from Seoul. Take a hike to Big Bill Hells, home of challenge docking. That's right, challenge docking. How does it work? If you can land an unstreamlined craft without crashing, you get no berthing fees. Don't wait, don't delay, don't fuck with us or we'll rip your nuts off. Only at Big Bill Hells, the only starport that tells you to fuck off. Hurry up, asshole. This event ends the minute you wire us crimps, and they better not bounce or you're a dead motherfucker. Go to hell. Big Bill Hell's Dock. Drill starts filthy to the exclusive home of the meanest sons of bitches in the deep. Guaranteed.